Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Torah.
So, as you may recollect, we were talking about donations, right? Vows of donations, and the fact that it needed to be estimated. We had a very interesting little piece that really felt a lot like oral Torah. Because it started off talking about donating an animal that might be put on the altar, meaning that it was in a perfect condition. And it also was one of the categories of animals, in other words, either cattle, sheep, or goats, and that you could actually donate a part of it, and how they went about estimating the value of the animal and the part that you wanted to donate, etc., and taking that and donating it to the temple treasury. So the Torah was actually getting into quite a bit of detail here. And then we went on to a passage which I initially misunderstood, which talked about an animal that could not be brought up on the altar. And fortunately, we have Rashi, thank God for Rashi and the tradition, who said, well, what we're really talking about here is an animal that isn't in perfect condition. In other words, even though it was one of the cattle, sheep, or bows, it was from the right category, but it nevertheless was imperfect in some way. And again, there, the whole animal then is estimated, etc., and in fact, the amount of money that the animal could be sold for is then given to the temple treasury. Now, people change their minds. And again, we're really having a beautiful example in the Torah itself of oral Torah. So, the im ga'ol yiga elenu. So the person has changed his mind. He decides he wants to
Mm.
redeem the animal. He wants the animal back, right? So how does he do this? Vayasaf chamishito al erkacha. So that what the animal, there's a penalty of some kind here. I don't know if we want to call it a penalty, but it could be, however one wants to understand this. There's a duty to be paid on it, meaning he has to. In other words, it gets well. Let's suppose the animal is estimated at $100, right? And then he has to add 1/5 to this estimation. Now, the thing you need to understand is that when the Torah talks about 1/5, it really is talking about 1/4. In other words, we're saying that it has to be 1/5 of what the total price will be. So in other words, so he'd have to add $25 to that. So it's $125. And if you figure it out, okay, that it would be that $25 is 1/5 of $125. So that's how this is worked out. So it's called milivar from outside. In other words, 1/5 of the total price, not of the initial price. So that's how the Torah understands and how the tradition understands this additional fifth that is added when the animal is redeemed. V'im ga'ol yigalenu, if in fact he wants to redeem the animal. And he says, Ba'alim, Rashi tells us, Ba'alim hichmir hakatuv, that scripture is more strict with the owner of the animal, lehosif chomesh, that he has to add 1/5, this 1/5, which of course is 1/4 of the initial of the estimated price, of the estimated value, right? And he says that when the person who donated the animal, in other words, changing your mind, you're going to have to pay a duty on that. So he says not only that, this is from Torah Kohanim, right? So we take this from the Sifra. V'chein b'makdish, buy it. And likewise, if somebody donates, right, and sanctifies a house, and this meaning that he's donated his house to the sanctuary, to the temple treasury. So again, if he wants to redeem his house, he has to take the value of the house and an added quarter to that value to make it 1/5 of the total amount. V'chein b'makdish et hasadeh, and likewise, if he donates his field, v'chein pidyon, right, ma'asar. And likewise, this is also if he wants to, this is talking here about the tithe that would be taken up to Jerusalem, where we have something, the concept of a second tithe, right? The first tithe of the produce. This we're talking about when the farmer had reaped his harvest, let's say it was grain, and he had taken the grain to his silo and smoothed out the grain so that it was ready to go to market. He had to take 1/10 of that and give that to the Levites. And then he had to take 1/10 of the remainder and take that up to Jerusalem to share with his family as part of the pilgrimage and of his pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. So that second tithe, if it was too much and he didn't want to take up the grain, he could redeem that second tithe. But he had to, in other words, they would have to estimate the amount that it was worth and then add another quarter to it, right? So that it was a fifth there. And that's what he's talking about. Pidyon Masar Sheni. This was second tithe. Haba'alim. So if someone else bought it, right? Bought that grain, then he could take that money and take it up, and that would simply be at the estimated price. But if he wanted to redeem it himself, right, haba'alim mosifim chomesh, the owners of that grain have to add 1/5. See if there's anything more here. Velo sha'ar kol adam. And Rashi says, but not other people. In other words, if he sold that grain that he wanted to take up to Jerusalem, then he had to take the money, right? The grain, it was fungible, right? So the money for the grain he could take up to Jerusalem and then purchase the food up there. And it's so lovely that the Torah, again, I think this idea that the Torah is not up in heaven. We're not talking just about ideals here. We're talking about practicalities. And I think this is a terribly significant element of Judaism, that we don't just want to speak about ideals. We want to be able to actually do these things. And if you're going to do these things, you're going to have to take into account circumstances. And I know that initially people say, oh, the oral Torah, what are we talking about? But here we have, as I said, examples in the written Torah of what we could honestly call oral Torah. And clearly, when it comes to circumstances, things get peeled away even more in more detail. And that's what the Mishnah deals with, and that's what the Talmud ultimately deals with. And then also all the tradition we have of, excuse me, I'm trying to get this back again, of all the halacha that we have. Let me find it here. Get back to the place. Okay, let me make sure. I hope I haven't gone too far. Yes, right. So we just did this, right? Let's see. Yes, here we go. Yeah, the ish, and now we have a different donation. The ish yakdish et beito. So again, he wants to donate his house, as it were, to the temple, right? So and they use the word yakdish, right, kodesh, which we say sanctified. But again, we see from the context here that it can mean dedicate, right? If he wants to dedicate his house, Kodesh Lashem, as dedicated to God, again, the Hericho HaKohen, and the priest has to estimate, right, evaluate what it is, what the house is worth, Bein Tov Uvein Ra. So it says, how good the house is or how not good the house is. Ka'asher yarichot HaKohen ken yakum. As the priest evaluates it, that is how it is established. The value of the house is established by the Kohen. Going on. Ve'im hamakdish, again, ve'im hamakdish yigal, going on. Et beito, if he wants to redeem his house, he doesn't want to actually donate the physical house to the temple treasury, but he wants to take his house back. It says, "Vayasaf chamishit kesef erkecha alav v'hayalo." In that case, he has the permission to do it, but he has to add this fifth, right, of money, of the initial value. Again, we're really talking about a quarter here, and then it becomes his. So the Torah explicitly tells us that he has that ability to change his mind and decide that he wants to keep the property itself and the fact that it's fungible and the value of the house uh, plus an additional uh, quarter of it, right, is in fact goes to the temple treasury. Going on, let's make sure this. Ve'im misde achuzato. And what about if it's from a field of his inheritance? In other words, he has inherited this field. It's a family field, right? Yakdish, and he wants to again dedicate this field ish Lashem. This person wants to donate it to Hashem, meaning, of course, the temple treasury. The way in which you evaluate the value of the field has to do with how the field is to be sown. In other words, how much seed the field is capable of being sown with. Zera, and there's a formula for this. Zera chomes orim, right? So for every chomer orim, we're talking about the barley, right? How much barley seed? B'chamishim shekel kesef. So for every let's make sure I have what it says here, right? So for a chomer is it's like a bushel, right? So I'm not saying a chomer is a bushel. I don't in front of me have the actual modern equivalent or the estimated equivalent of what a chomer is, but let's just say translated for the sake of understanding, every bushel of barley seed, b'chamishim shekel kesef. That figures out 50 shekels of silver. Okay, so it has to do with how, in other words, how fertile the field is and how much seed can be sown in the field. That's the basis of the formula of evaluating the field. So let's see. V'haya erkacha lefi zar'o, right? So the evaluation should be according to how it can be sown. V'lo kefi shaveha achat sadeh tova. So you don't simply decide which field is good, right? In other words, it's not what the field might be equivalent to. In other words, okay, right. So I think it's saying that we're talking about sad. Okay, achat sadeh tova v'achat sadeh ra'ah. I believe Rashi is saying it doesn't make a difference whether it's a good field or maybe not an attractive field, right? Pidyon hekdeshan, right? The amount of redemption for donating them, shavin, right? It's all the same. Beit kor seorim. So apparently, I think a beit kor would be the rabbinic terminology for a chomer, right? A beit kor of seorim, of barley seed, b'chamishim shkalim, would be worth 50 shekels. Kach gzeirat hakatuv. This is an edict on the part of Scripture. V'hu sheba lagala, and one who comes to redeem it. But chilat hayovel. So again, it also has to do with the fact that we know that in the 50th year, right, in the Jubilee year, the fields, if they were sold, would be returned to the initial owner. We're told this, I believe, in earlier on in Bahar. We talked about the laws regarding the Shemitah year, the 7th year, where the land lays fallow, and then 7 Shemitah years, and then the 50th year is the Ovel, where if a field is sold, it then goes back to the original owner. So this calculation is based if the field is sold at the beginning of that 50-year cycle, because we're really talking about harvests. And this is part of what the Torah is trying to teach us, that we don't own the land, we own the usage of the land, right? So again, the idea that we really don't own any property. So here we go. V'imba lega'aleh be'imtza'o. So what happens if it's 25 years into the Jubilee year? Okay, he's not going to get as many harvests, right? So if it's sold according to the harvest, this formula that we just read is one that happens at the beginning of that Jubilee cycle. So noten lefi cheshbon. So you have to figure it out, right? That if he wants to redeem this field in the middle of the Jubilee cycle, hacheshbon, according to this particular formula, sela upundion. So it's a sela and a pundion. So a sela is must be a part of I think there, if I'm not mistaken, there could be a 49 in a shekel, and a pudyon would be that little bit extra lishana. So, for example, for each year remaining, right, he would have to redeem it at a pudyon and a sela. Lefi, why? She'ena hekdesh ela leminyan shnei hayovel, because it's not dedicated. That when you dedicate it, it's according to the number of years in the Jubilee year. She'im ga'ala, right? The right. If it im nig'ala, if it were to be redeemed. Hare tov, ve'im lav, right? So let me make sure I've got this. She'im nigala hare tov ve'im lav hagizbar muchra bedamim. Right. So I'm not sure what exactly Rashi is saying here. Me, do you have a good translation there? Okay. If you're muted, you need to unmute.
I'm unmuting and I'm unvideoing. Okay. All right. So we are at uh which one?
We're on verse 15 on the
All right.
Rashi here.
15 Rashi, there is nothing. That goes from 13 to 16 in his commentary.
Oh, I'm sorry, it is 16. We're looking at 16.
All right, so 16.
And it's a long
Okay.
commentary and it's down
Right, right,
into it.
right. Okay, here we go. I mean, I can read the whole thing. It is long.
Okay, so what I'm trying to do. Okay,
Which
so we're
specific
looking at the
phrase?
part, okay, he says, Lafisha ina hektesh ela leminyan shnei yovel. He says that it isn't, that when he dedicates the field, it is dedicated according to the number of years left in the Jubilee year, right? She'im
Yes.
nigala, that because if
Yes.
it's going to be redeemed, hare tov, that's fine. In
Right.
love, but if not, if it's not revealed, if it's not redeemed at that point, hal gizbar mochara b'damim halalu.
It says the treasurer of the Beit HaMikdash sells it for
Yes,
this price.
right.
For example, a
Right.
shekel and a
Pundion.
punyan per
Right.
year until a
Right.
yovel.
Right. Exactly. Okay, so that's what he's saying here.
Yeah,
La'acher, to another person. He can sell it
to
to
someone
someone
else.
else. Right.
Exactly. Yes.
Omitted biyad halokeach, and it remains in the property as the property of the one
Of the
who bought
buyer
it, right, of the person who bought it, ad shnat hayovel, I'm sure.
until a yovel year.
Okay, I can go on. Thank you. Thank you. That's
Okay.
very helpful.
All
Until
right.
the kishar kol hasadot hamechurot, just like any other situation where a person has sold their field not to the temple, where he hasn't dedicated his field to the temple. So let me just review that for a moment. What we're talking about is a situation where A dedicates his field to the temple treasury. Okay. And it's in the middle of the Yovel cycle. And the treasurer of the temple is allowed then to sell that field to someone else according to this formula, right? A seller and a
Right.
pudyin according to the number of years remaining, right?
Right.
And it remains in the buyer's possession up until the
The
Yovel year.
yovel.
That's
Right.
now here we go. Ukeshehi yotzah miyado. However, in the Yovel year, when the field is no longer his property, he no longer has the ownership of this field. Chozeret lakohanim. This field now goes to the priests. Okay, shiloto mishmar, that are of that particular watch. So you have to understand that I believe there were 24 priestly families.
Right.
And so that each family would take a week of service in the temple. And so in the course of a year, basically, they had 2 weeks in which they could serve in the temple. And so the particular family that was in that watch would receive that field, right?
Right.
Oto mishmar shahayovel pogea bo, in which the yovel occurs. Umitchaleket beinehem, and that family then can divide this field, right? So in other words, they can then, if they want to, they can then either take possession of that field or sell it, right? Zehu hamishpat. So again, if the Kohanim sell it, again, it would go back to the Kohanim. Essentially, what it's saying is that sadly, if the original owner doesn't redeem the field himself, he loses it in the Yovel year. He has until the Yovel year in which to get it back. Okay, ha'amur. Let's see. Zehu hamishpat ha'amur b'makdish sadeh. This is the law which is stated with one who dedicates a field. V'achshav afarshenu, and Rashi is now saying to us personally, and now I will explain this. Al Seder HaMikraot. So he's given us the general way in which this is done, and now he's going to take a look at these verses and explain each verse in its own specific context.
If
Thank
I
you.
can jump in the middle for a
Yes, no,
second,
this is fine. I'm at
the
the end of the
the
Rashi.
the additional interpolated
Yes,
translation
go
in my
ahead.
edition says
Yes,
that the it goes to the watch that's officiating on Yom Kippur of the Yovel year.
right.
Yeah,
Okay. No, that's no.
as
Thank
opposed to
you.
just one of the watches, because obviously the
Right.
watches take place,
Well,
they
remember
rotate.
they do. They rotate, and
Yep,
and I'm not sure that that particular family, that it's the same family that gets to watch on Yom Kippur, because like I say, if they're more than 48 weeks in a year.
right. Some of them have 3 weeks according to this book.
Right, right. Because they're actually 54, I believe.
Right,
Okay. So yeah, so it isn't a specific watch that gets the Yom Kippur week,
right.
but that rotates. Yes. No, that's very helpful, Mead. It did not come through in my interpretation of it here. So
Okay,
this is let's see where we want to go. Yep, we're going to be up here next time we meet.
okay.
So right there. So again, I'm going to stop the share right now and just say it's really very cool how, that here we are reading in the Torah about these particular rules going on and how they're even though at this point we don't have enough information to be able to apply it in every circumstance, but we're given a much more detailed way in which to deal with this depending on the circumstances. So with this, I'm going to stop the recording.